Hello and welcome to Roofing Economic Outlook. My name is Heidi Ellsworth and I am here with Mischa Fisher with Angi, the Chief Economist. And this is our second episode. So hopefully you've already watched episode 0 and episode 1 and you'll realize how great this is. So Mischa, welcome back to Roofing Economic Outlook.
Hey, it's always fun to be back. This is a great conversation and it was a great idea. So looking forward to today's as well.
So I have to start globally, and especially with what is happening in Ukraine. How do you see this affecting the U.S. economy and specifically construction?
That is definitely a topical question. And the first preface is whenever we talk about these things, we have to first and foremost remember the human toll that these things take. There are, tens of thousands of people dead already from this conflict. So that is the first thing to remember is that even though we tend to think about the economic implications, there are people who were a month or two ago happily living their lives and going to work and living in their homes, and now millions of them have been displaced. So that's obviously the first thing to keep in mind. Construction, I think, won't immediately be a big impact for construction, generally speaking. It'll obviously hit food prices in particular, could be hit because both Ukraine and Russia produce a lot of grain, and transportation could be hit pretty heavily. And we sort of get some impact of that from the rising gas prices. But construction by itself is not necessarily as exposed as other sectors. But this is not a construction podcast. This is a roofing podcast. And that's a little bit different for roofing because we use a lot of petroleum-based products. And if the price of hydrocarbons goes up, then we could start to see it reflected in materials prices in ways that, for example, the lumber industry might not.
And what we are seeing is how much the roofing industry and all construction rely on their trucks and getting from job site to job site and equipment. And so I've also been hearing that from contractors that the price of gas, is over $100 to fill their tanks. And I have not heard anyone complain because, to your point, I think everyone knows we're in this together to support democracy and what's going on. But it still has a hit on the companies overall.
Yeah, and gas prices are sort of their own issue. We polled the Angi network specifically for pros, and 95% said, we expect this to have an impact and prices are going to go up higher. But only 75% said that they were actually going to raise their rates as a result of it. And, it's important to protect your bottom line. And if your operating costs go up, you've got to make sure that you have a strategy to handle that and you build a process in. Even if this time you choose not to raise your rates, you should have a process in place where if costs go over a certain threshold, you do raise them.
Right. Yeah, that's the key. And I think there's so many little things hitting from so many different areas that it's just eroding that profit. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a little while, but it is, they aren't realizing how much it's hitting them from so many different directions. The stock market has been very volatile this whole year, and definitely in March. Is there anything contractors should be doing around these fluctuations of the stock market? Kind of what's some of your advice that direction?
My advice is actually personal advice, which is you should be saving for retirement. You should have money in a tax sheltered account like anybody. So it's less tied to your business and more tied to your own personal finances. If you are busy running your business and doing the work and focusing on industry pieces, it can be easy to lose sight of your own personal retirement. Don't let it. When the market is down, buy into it, right? There's a weird psychology where people get really depressed when the market goes down, which isn't how you should think about it. Because right now you're in the market to buy equity, not to sell equity. You want to sell it when you retire. Right now you want it to be cheap. So buy in the dips. That's my big personal advice. In terms of the fluctuations in the market, unless you're a publicly traded company, I think that it doesn't have that big of an impact on your day-to-day, but certainly be thinking through it in terms of your personal retirement, right? I mean, we are an industry that tends to be very disaggregated, lots of sole props, lots of small shops. So nobody's offering you a pension necessarily. So make sure you're planning for your own retirement and buy the dip.
Yeah, That is great advice. And it was interesting as I was reading up on some of this morning. They were talking about how March always seems to have a lot of volatility, no matter what year it is. They were kind of going back through the decades. And I found that really interesting because I was like, what is it about March? Any thoughts on that?
Well, you can get these seasonal patterns in it. I'm always somebody who recommends long-term investing. Short-term is just gambling.
Yeah.
Long-term, invest. Pick areas where you think the fundamentals are strong, buy the dip, and then hold.
There is pressure from the U.S. Federal Reserve to the central bank to increase interest rates. How should roofing companies again prepare for this in case interest rates go up?
If you're a roofing company that's relying on debt, on loans to fuel your growth or to handle things, recognize that when interest rates go up, the price of that debt is getting more expensive. That's not necessarily a big deal. If you're running your business well, you can plan ahead, and the changes are kind of nominal. Ideally, what this means is inflation comes back under control and people are no longer running the risk of having their profits eaten up by inflation that they weren't expecting. So hopefully it means a less volatile environment, and hopefully they don't overshoot it and we end up with some sort of stagflation environment, which a lot of people listening might not even remember that period or might not have even been born during that period. But stagflation is not a good thing. We want to avoid that. There are some benefits to the current interest rate inflation regime. The biggest one being that lots of your customers are homeowners who own a bunch of debt and they own an asset. And that debt effectively has a negative interest rate right now under the current paradigm of higher interest rates. And that's obviously beneficial for their net worth because the debt that they created to buy this asset is getting cheaper proportionally, and they're effectively being paid to hold on to it. So that's a benefit for them in terms of people who are out there buying your services. They're getting a little bit richer. If they own homes, it's a very bad time not to be an asset holder. On the flip side, you can also think about the people who are in their homes right now on cheap mortgages. And as interest rates go up, which the Fed just raised them, as they go up further, you're going to get people potentially locked into a lower mortgage, and they're not going to want to buy into a more expensive home because that debt's expensive. So it's a better deal just to spend to fix things up. So obviously roofing is a very specific category versus, a general remodeler or something, but that is something to be aware of.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, that is true because they're going to want to. They're not going to be moving, which is going to also affect the real estate market, which has been so hot. I mean, it's just there's kind of a whole domino effect. It seems like this going on.
Yeah, and that'll be the biggest area impact is as interest rates go up, that will hit home sales. It'll definitely more or less turn off refinances, and home sales will slow down.
So as the contractors are continuing to see price increases, material shortages, and long delivery times, we are hearing how this has affected overall profitability. We talked about this at the beginning, and this is what I kind of want to go into, especially for some very large construction firms. They're announcing losses if they are on publicly traded. They're announcing that, but we're also hearing about this from other contractors on that it's just their profit margins are being eaten away. What is some of your suggestions? I know you said a little bit about this earlier, but what are some of your suggestions for contractors to stay profitable and kind of weather through some of this?
Inflation is the cruelest tax. That's what economists call it. And I was actually just on a webinar recently with a lawyer, and the two of us were presenting how you sort of protect your business. And it was quite interesting because he phrased it really well on his side. He was pointing out that you've got to protect your business from litigation because you've done all this work. You've put years of your life into your business and your savings, and a clerical issue with your legal paperwork could potentially cost you a significant portion of that. Similarly, you want to protect your business from inflation because if we were to come along and overtly tax you at some high level, you would notice it. And you would say, okay, what's going on here? I got to protect this. But with inflation, the reason why it's nicknamed the cruelest, in part, is because you don't see it. You don't know how much it's impacting you. So if you are used to a certain set of pricing and the pricing of all your inputs goes up, but you're keeping a lower increase in what you're charging your customers, all of your profit can evaporate and you won't even necessarily see it coming, because all of those things compound and it's easy to lose sight across all those inputs. So right now, people are sort of saying, if you look at the popular press, the quoted inflation line is 8 to 9%. If that's what you're using as your benchmark, your rule of thumb, your fast heuristic for how you're thinking about it, that's probably going to bite you later. Because if you look at the pricing for increases in materials and construction, the overall price indices are more like 30% increase. And you've got to be really cognizant of how much your raw materials are part of your final profit and factor that in and recognize that they're probably not coming down this year, that wages are also slated to rise even further. And as a result, all of your profit could vanish, even though you're raising prices and running everything else even more efficiently, it can still disappear. So really make sure you're tracking what every single one of your things is, but also what every single one of your costs, how it's changed from last year. You want to make sure you're tracking both.
We're also hearing about the movement of funds for larger projects from the infrastructure bill. We're actually starting to hear some of that starting to come through. Are you seeing any trickle down to the home improvement sector? And is it causing additional problems for smaller contractors when it comes to material and labor? Because that was a big concern, that we have this big infrastructure bill and it's going to suck out all the materials and labor.
The good news and the bad news is that the government doesn't typically do things very quickly.
Yes.
So obviously as a taxpayer, that's kind of a bummer. But the good news, if you're competing for the same labor and the same materials, is it typically doesn't all come out at once. I remember during the last recession, there were some stimulus programs that hadn't been spent a decade later, right? I mean, these things can really, really take a long time to get out the door. Right now, non-residential construction employment is still down pretty considerably from before the pandemic. It's still down about 6% or 7% in that ballpark. I would expect that would eventually comes back up, because some of that reason why they haven't been working is because there hasn't necessarily been as much infrastructure spending. It's also that there might have been less factory spending or commercial construction spending, those sorts of things. But I would expect that eventually they start pulling in and eventually they start competing for things. But if you look at a lot of infrastructure, they're not buying necessarily the same materials as we are in residential construction. You don't see big public infrastructure projects using a lot of framing lumber necessarily, right? Maybe they might for a retaining wall or something, but they're going to be using aggregates and asphalt and heavy equipment that's used for road laying. The other thing, though, is that it does come in, typically it's more seasonal in many cases. So, there's a road, we all know from summer travel that there's a road paving season and there's a bridge building season. We have these seasonal impacts in non-residential construction. So this summer, I would expect that puts some price pressure on those materials that residential shares with non-residential. But I don't think right now, beyond just sort of anecdotal evidence, that it's impacting anybody at this moment, particularly with the roofing overlap.
Well, and paving, oil, kind of goes back to what you said at the very beginning. That could be the one place where we may feel it more than others. Asphalt shingles, asphalt buildup.
Yeah, I mean, any one of your listeners, I mean, make sure you're talking actively to your distributors about what they're seeing and hearing for prices, and make good friends with that person so that you can get those inside tips on when they anticipate price rises.
Exactly, man. That is one of the most important things I think there is out there, networking and really having that relationship with your distributors and your manufacturers. I'm always really interested in what's going on around sustainability. And so green energy, we're hearing about it. And now with the rising gas prices, we're hearing even more. The need, what's coming out of Tesla with solar. So any thoughts on that sector and kind of what you're seeing on the future, that outlook of more sustainability, wind, solar, all of the green bills that are coming out of DC?
I think will have a pretty limited impact in the short term. In the long term, we will change how we generate electricity and how we use electricity. Right now, people like to talk a lot about electric cars, and that can certainly save you money at the pump right now. Whether or not it saves you enough to make up for the higher price electric vehicle depends on the electric vehicle. But if you're producing electricity using the same burning of hydrocarbons, you're not really, all you're doing is introducing the inefficiency of a transmission system. So that's why I think a lot of this stuff can be kind of at the margins initially. In the long term, we will change these things. I do think that for roofing in particular, solar will continue to be huge as people do that, as electricity prices go up, and as consumers change their preference, and as the price of panels comes down. All of those things, I think, will drive it. Battery technology has to improve. The overall story, though, I think is going to be kind of limited short term, but yeah, it'll be over the long term, over the next 30, 50, 100 years, we'll certainly see how we use energy change a lot. But over the next 2, 3, I think pretty limited in terms of seeing dramatic changes anywhere.
About the same that it's been as it continues to grow out there.
Marginal changes,
Yeah.
small incremental every year is typically the story with these things.
Well, and as always, one of my last questions I always want to ask you, Mischa, is what are you hearing that we haven't talked about? What are we missing? What's something that the contractors should be looking out for?
I think the main thing that I've really been thinking a lot about is what we're paying labor and whether or not that has to rise much more than it has been. That's not something that anybody who's running a business wants to hear, but we need to pull people into the industry. We need to train them. We need to keep them. And if you look at that wage premium, I think it needs to be a little bit higher. So that's, I think, the number one thing is we've got a lot of great things going for the industry. It's a great time to enter. People can jump in from a lot of sectors and make more money, but are they they might need to make even more money in order to really pull the talent in it. So that's something that I'm having a lot of conversations about and thinking pretty deeply about and hoping others are as well.
That's every business. I can tell you in our business, we're seeing the exact same thing. And
Right.
so we've got to make some changes that way, and hopefully, and the economy will go with it, because that's just how it's going to be to get the talent. So
It's all connected.
thank you all for listening and watching. This is the kind of information that we feel at Roofers Coffee Shop and at Angi, how important it is to bring this to you, to help your businesses grow, to be prepared. And so thank you for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next Roofing Economic Outlook.